So arteries, let's think about structure. We have smooth muscle, we have connective tissue with a fair amount of elastic fibers. Remember from anatomy, the elastic fibers that stretch and recoil. Every single blood vessel is lined with simple squamous epithelium because it's friction free. It's also thin in the capillaries for diffusion. It's sometimes referred to as endothelium. So simple squamous epithelium. And arteries are what we call the pressure reservoir for the vascular system because their job is to keep blood moving. We have to maintain some pressure. And the way we do that is we still have pressure during diastole. So when we think about pressures, think about systolic pressure. You've probably heard like somewhere that an ideal blood pressure is like 120/80, only now they want it to be 120/70 as they change the standards, which medicine does all the time. And the systolic pressure, the 120, is the pressure during ventricular contraction. So as blood is being pushed in, we raise the pressure as the blood is stretching the arteries. But that pressure is important because it's what's going to keep blood moving. The diastolic pressure is the pressure in the artery. Now, this is where I said the ventricle goes to zero, but the artery cannot fall to zero. We've got to keep the pressure going. So that's why we have diastolic pressure. So this is a picture from your book that shows that when the left ventricle contracts and we push blood into the aorta, and they're going to expand. See how they stretch outwards? Then during diastole, we get this elastic recoil, pushing back in to keep the blood flowing all the way through. Oops, I should put it over here. All the way through the heartbeat. So when the heart is relaxing and refilling, the arteries keep things moving. And this is why we want an elastic artery. We don't want a hard artery. We need it to be able to stretch. If somebody has a plaque buildup in their arteries or arterial sclerosis or hardening in the arteries, we don't get this elastic expansion the way we should. So when we're talking about these pressures, the other thing they've come up with is, let's look at what is the difference in pressure. So we have something called the pulse pressure, which is simply the systolic minus the diastolic. So if we take that average that I wrote before of 120/70, then we would see that the pulse pressure is simply 120 minus 70, which is 50 millimeters of mercury of pulse pressure, meaning that is the amount of blood being, it's not an amount, but it's the pressure on the blood pushing it forward. And pressure is always measured in millimeters of mercury. And we take the blood pressure. Now, normally we spend a whole lab taking blood pressures, playing with the blood pressure cuff, learning how to do it the old-fashioned way. But I want to just kind of think about what's happening. When the blood pressure is taken, it's about the pressure in the artery versus the pressure in the cuff. And the thump sounds that you hear if you're taking a blood pressure are called Korotkoff sounds. I hope I pronounced that correctly. It is not the heart valves. It's not lub-dub. It's thump. What you're hearing when you take a blood pressure is thump. And here's what we have. So if we take the cuff and we put it above your systolic pressure, we should hear nothing, no sound, and at the stethoscope. And there's no blood flow because we've used the cuff to literally compress the artery to the point where blood can't flow through. Then we start to release the pressure. And when the pressure in the cuff matches the systolic pressure will push blood past the cuff. And we get this swirling. It's called turbulent blood flow here. And that makes the audible thumping sound. And you'll hear it go thump, 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 as it comes down, and you're going to release the pressure slowly. And then when the diastolic pressure is greater than the pressure in the cuff, blood is just flowing easily, and we get something called laminar flow. And then we have no sound. So this is one of the tricks to taking a blood pressure with a cuff is you're listening for the thump sound. It's not, I repeat, the sound of the valves. Now, when we take that blood pressure, we can calculate the pulse pressure. One of the things that we do as an indication of health is called the mean arterial pressure, MAP, the MAP, which is basically the mean, not the average, but the mean of the pressure that causes blood to flow. And the way they calculate that is they say it's the diastolic pressure plus 1/3 of the pulse pressure. So we had a diastolic pressure of 70, we had a pulse pressure of 50, and in this case, rounding is fine. Always go to the nearest whole number. So we have 48 is divisible by 3, and we have 51. So at 50, we're really close to 51, so 17. Here, you don't need decimals. You can actually do the easy thing and just go to the nearest whole number. So the mean arterial pressure in this case is 87, which is a nice normal mean arterial pressure. And that's kind of like a average of what the arteries are withstanding for stress. But if we exercise and cardiac output is greater, the systolic will go up. This is to indicate the higher stroke volume. But we don't want diastolic to increase because diastolic needs to move forward. So we need the artery to relax and keep blood moving. So a modest increase in the mean arterial pressure is what we want. And we want higher systolic and pulse pressure, but a normal diastolic pressure.